Hey there, welcome to the garden. It is getting dark out here. It's so funny, in the summer I spend so much time out in the garden in the evenings, and it feels kind of different to be out here in the evening. I haven't been getting down to the garden for my usual gardening evenings in a long time, but I'm back out here tonight, just kind of poking around the garden. Honestly, at this point, there's not a whole lot to do, but I am really still reflecting on my 2023 garden season, the highs and the lows. And I wanted to do the last video of my kind of like reflection series and talk about the things that didn't go well this year. Obviously, on like social media and stuff, it's really easy to highlight all of the things that are going well, but I like to make sure that I'm also sharing with you the failures and the things that don't go well, because inevitably throughout the garden season I always have things that don't do so well. And this year there were a few kind of like notable ones that made me kind of like just take stock and think about future planning, I guess. So I want to highlight those failures and anything else that I can think of. The biggest one, I guess, well, there's always sort of two categories. I feel like in my garden, I like to think about things. There's the ornamentals, and then there are the food crops and the edibles. So I guess I'll start with the edibles. Probably the biggest one that was a real failure this year were my squash. So squash is something that does need quite a bit of space, and it typically likes a lot of full sun and room to just grow, lots of food, in the soil. It really likes all of that. And that is a challenge in my small garden space. And my son, I don't have a lot of the like full sun areas, so it can be kind of tricky for me. I did try to put as like a zucchini, an 8-ball zucchini, in a 15-gallon grow bag in a very full sun area, and I just didn't have good luck with it. They all got taken out by vine borers, really. I mean, that was the biggest thing that killed all of the plants. So, the vine borers came in and really took out all of the squash plants mid-season. Now, the area that I had them growing in, though, that 15-gallon grow bag, I grew like right next to it. I grew a really beautiful pumpkin on a stick eggplant, and it was amazing and did great. So I know there's like lots of full sun, plenty of space. 15 gallons should be enough, but it just didn't go well. And I also grew some of my raised bed, and that did not grow well either. So definitely something like I'm gonna learn from. I probably won't try to do squash. I mean, maybe I would try in a container, but more and more I'm starting to feel like containers are not the best space for squash plants, which is kind of disappointing because I do a lot of container gardening, but I think I will make a conscious effort in the future to put them either in like in-ground places or in raised beds, that kind of area, and like devote some full sun area to them as well. I also tried again. Now I will, just one last thing on the squash. I have grown it semi-successfully in grow bags before. So this year was just like a little bit strange, but still I do think that like an in-ground situation might be a better spot for them. I also tried to grow some melons, and yeah, really terrible luck with it. I think my garden is very compact. I tend to push a lot of the spacing limits for a lot of my plants, and sometimes that really works. Like I've been able to push the limits with eggplants and tomatoes and peppers, but these vining crops, it's definitely an area for me to keep growing and learning, and it really certainly was very hard for them. Melons, I just have not been able to get melons growing, even like the small varieties. I've gotten a few of those like supposed to be more compact melon plants, and just had like very, very poor luck with them. So I'm not sure. I think, again, maybe in a future space, if I have like only so much in-ground space, like a raised bed, full sun, I think that would be what I would do for the melons, because it just has been a struggle consistently in containers, and even this year without enough space, like they just didn't do anything. Along that line, I also tried to grow some pumpkins, and I actually got two little Jack little pumpkins. I got 2 little pumpkins off the vine, but of course, like some of these things do need a lot of space. And so, yeah, it just, in a tiny garden, in a tiny container garden, there are some things that are like a little bit hard. So gonna have to continue kind of working on what I would do to maybe make it possible for them to grow, but it was a challenge this year for sure. I did get some seeds. I think it's called Weeby Little. I'm gonna have to double check that, but it is a pumpkin that grows more like a zucchini, I guess, where it's like a bush habit that grows up. And so I think I am gonna try some of those and play around with that. And so I think part of it might just be that I really need to keep trying different varieties until I can find some things that that work better, I guess, when it comes to these kinds of vining sort of crops. As far as that goes, the other edible that I really had sort of trouble with this year were my tiny tomatoes, which are some of my favorites. I've done the Tiny Tomato Club over on Instagram where like everybody's growing tiny tomatoes and sharing. Like, I love tiny tomatoes, and I did do a couple in some little containers and they did well, but I put most of mine in a window box, and this was totally user error. I just like did not water fertilize consistently, not in the right way that I should have. I know better, and they didn't do well. Like, just did not do well. And it was I don't know, I guess just like a reminder of, yeah, you need to really, you know, in container gardening, you need to stay on top of fertilizer, you need to stay on top of water, and if you don't, it just doesn't go well. So I was kind of disappointed myself. I guess my tiny tomatoes this season were pretty much a total failure, other than I had a couple pots up on the upstairs garden patio that did pretty well. So those were good, but yeah, I just did not devote enough attention to it. One of my sort of mystery edibles that I was surprised didn't do well this year was my basil. It was so strange. Typically, basil is a really consistent grower for me. I mean, herbs in general are usually fairly, like, I hate to say that anything is easy, because I feel like depending on what garden space you have, anything can be a challenge. Like, people always say radishes are easy, and they've been one of the hardest things for me to grow in my particular like microclimate zone, just so hard. So I hate to say like easy, but typically basil is pretty much like you plant it and it grows. And I just struggled with it this year. The only, like, all of the basil that I seeded, like, didn't really come up. It didn't really get going. Even the basil I tried to start inside didn't do super well. I had one basil plant that did pretty well that I bought mid-season, like in July, as a plant. That did pretty well. But everything else just kind of, I don't know, didn't take off this year. So that might have been like a weather thing or something. I love basil because I can kind of rely on it to do pretty well in part shade. Typically basil doesn't mind having a little bit of a part shade environment. But yeah, this, for whatever reason, I haven't quite figured it out. I'm assuming it was either like kind of cool. I'm trying to remember if it was like cooler this spring. I don't know. Yeah, I guess I'm basically stumped, but that was kind of a really noticeable one for me. I was really surprised that basil didn't grow, and I wanted to like make sure that this coming season I really devote some particular space and time and energy to making sure that I get a good basil harvest, because it's one of my favorite herbs, and it's one of those herbs that I really like to use a lot and utilize a lot. And so I definitely don't want to just like let that one go. I really want to figure that out and make sure I have that locked down for the coming growing seasons, that I know how to get a consistent basil harvest, because I know I'll use a ton of it. It is a great one for containers, and I didn't grow as much of it in containers this year, and so maybe it's just a lesson that I need to go back and grow more basil in containers, because that just seems to do better. And there's always like some things that do better in containers, some things that don't, just kind of like you always figure out. Another thing that didn't do well for me this year were my slicer tomatoes. So I had an incredible tomato harvest with all of the cherry tomatoes and saladette tomatoes that I grew on the arch trellis. But I decided to put my like my beefsteak tomatoes, my big tomatoes, over on the fence line. I was hoping that they would just grow up and get tall enough that they would get enough sunlight and then do really well. I think it was a combination of they just didn't have enough sun like, so they couldn't really get up to the top of that fence line quick enough, and then the arch trellis got so huge so fast that it ended up kind of shading them out, and they didn't end up doing well. So it was definitely a reminder of like, when you have a small garden and you have, you have certain areas that are like your prime full sun areas, your prime spots. If I want to get a couple big slicer tomatoes, which I definitely want next year, growing them out on the trellis would definitely be the move. We are obviously moving, if you haven't seen, we're moving out of this garden, so I won't be in this garden next season, but I definitely will be devoting some full sun space wherever I am at to some big slicer tomatoes, because I like to make tomato sandwiches, and I like to just have that option, something a little bit bigger. So those were kind of like my biggest, most notable failures from the season. Luckily, I got a lot of food out of the garden, and I felt like I had a pretty good season. There's always challenges every year, but I felt like we got a few good edibles. So now we can talk about the flower failures. There were some flower failures for sure. One of my biggest, saddest flower failures was I ordered a David Austin rose. Actually, it's still alive, so it didn't die, but it did not flower. It did not really take off. Princess Margarita David Austin rose to grow in a container, and it came fairly late in the season. So by the time it came in the spring, definitely it was like, I think it was good timing on their part in the sense that it was well past any frost and it was good growing time. But at that point, the small garden had just grown up so much that when I put it in the container where I had it located, it just didn't get enough sun. So I definitely didn't devote enough sun to it. I'm gonna try to bring it with me. Well, hopefully it'll work, to California when we move, and it's gonna get a full sun location, and we're gonna try to get it going because it's such a beautiful, it's the most incredible, beautiful rose. Stunning, and I just didn't give it quite the love that it needed, so I'm gonna try to transport it basically bare root. We'll see what happens. It's so beautiful. Oh my gosh. I did have another rose that I got a little bit earlier in the season. That was bare root as well, and I put it in the container. It got more sun in the beginning because it was here earlier before things had grown up, and it did better. It actually ended up blooming and everything. So that's just how it goes. With these parts shade, parts sun gardens, you just have times when if you just don't get it in time, or you don't get it in the right spot, sometimes things don't get enough sun. And then another one of my flower failures was some of my zinnias. I wanted to do a lot of apricot zinnias, and again, planted them in a place where they were right next to the tomatoes, and the tomatoes just grew so fast that they just totally shaded them out before they even got started. Kind of the same thing that happened with the rose. They just didn't have enough time and space to get established before the tomatoes got huge, and then they didn't flower. And so that was kind of disappointing because I really wanted to have it was the peach rose. I got the seeds, I think I got them, where did I get them? Johnny seeds maybe, but they were a peach colored rose, a peach colored, apricot colored zinnia, and they just didn't get going in time. Another plant, kind of in the flower variety, I made this really pretty container that was it was kind of like a cottage garden themed container, and I loved it. It was so pretty, really beautiful when I got it planted, but it was one of those cases where the plant combination wasn't great, and so it actually once it got started, I had this really cute little, I guess it's a clover, really cute little clover in it that looked great and cottagey, and it just took over the entire container. And I had some Nemesia in there, some Angelonia, Gara, and just was way too, they couldn't handle. They just could not, all those flowers just could not compete with the clover, and so it ended up kind of just the container kind of fizzled out, and so it was just kind of a bummer. And then I think the last flower that I wanted to highlight was the Gara. It's really pretty perennial. I put it in a couple different containers. It was in that cottage container, and it was in a couple other containers. I love Gara. It's such a wispy, beautiful plant, and it can kind of fill in and around other plants. But I didn't put it in enough sun, and it didn't really do much. So I want to make sure I'm highlighting, because I do push in my own gardening, I push the light requirements, I push the space requirements a lot. Like I plant things too close together, and I plant things into part shade situations, or put containers, you know, some in the sun, some out of the sun. And I just want to make sure that I'm being fully transparent with you when it doesn't work, that like when you garden like that and you push the limits the way that I do, you do end up with things that can't handle it, that don't grow as well. And so I just like want to make sure that I'm not making, I don't know, if you do something and you see me doing, you're like, why did that work for her? Like sometimes it doesn't. So I try to make sure like at the end of the season or throughout the season that I'm giving you those updates, just so you don't think like, why did my garden do well in shade? And it's like, mine didn't either. That was bad, you know. Maybe just watch for inspiration, not always a how-to from me, because sometimes I am kind of pushing those limits. But yeah, that was sad, and that was definitely a plant that I want to keep working with and put into a lot more containers, because it's like really, really, really pretty. And I'm trying to think if there was anything else that was like a notable failure. I don't think I had too much. I did lose a lot of I had some trouble with some of my seedlings coming out, you know, that always happens, things like that. But I think those were like my biggest like lessons learned, and plants that I want to continue working with and keep trying to figure out. It's just always a process. But this is a good time of year right now, you know, as you're getting ready to do more seed ordering and planting and seed starting. It's just good to go back and think back on the season, look back at the old pictures. It's funny how much you forget just from the summer. Like when I sat down to make these videos, I was kept like having to go back and look at pictures and stuff just to think through like what I don't know. Maybe it's just me because I have a toddler and a baby, so I haven't had as much sleep in this last year, but I had to really kind of like go back and think like, what did I grow? What really did do well? What didn't? You know, it's just a good process of learning, because ultimately gardening is always learning. You can probably tell that the sun has fully set. It's really pretty though. We've been having super pretty sunsets, and it was nice to get out here in the garden just a little bit in the evening. Well, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.